The last thing I expected, standing in front of my childhood home with my suitcase in hand, was to hear the click of a new lock and my brother's voice saying, "You don't live here anymore." I thought I'd lost everything: my home, my family, my sense of belonging. But then a lawyer called me with news that would flip the story and the power on its head. If you've ever felt unwanted or invisible in your own family, you need to hear. Tanner Hayes hadn't planned on returning home. Not like this. Not after pouring 3 years of his life, his soul, and every dollar he had into a startup that promised revolution but delivered collapse. Just 3 weeks earlier, he was pitching to investors in Austin. Now he stood outside his childhood home in Asheville, North Carolina, gripping the handle of a worn duffel bag and trying not to let the shame crack him wide open. The colonial-style house hadn't changed much. 2 stories of white brick, dark green shutters, and a red front door that once signaled warmth. It was the kind of home people drove by and imagined stability, love, security. But for Tanner, standing at the foot of the driveway, it only whispered reminders of everything he wasn't. He walked up the familiar path, rehearsing the words he'd practiced in the car just for a few months. "I'll get back on my feet soon." He had nowhere else to go, no income, rent overdue, and the startup's quiet death left him with more debt than dignity. When the door opened, it wasn't warmth that greeted him. It was Connor. His older brother stood tall in the doorway, his expression unreadable, arms crossed like a gatekeeper. Once the golden boy of the family, Connor now ran Hayes Realty alongside their parents. Clean-cut, confident, and relentlessly pragmatic, he looked like he'd stepped out of a lifestyle magazine about suburban success. "You're early," Connor said. "Mom thought you'd be here later. I got on the road sooner. Figured traffic might be bad." Connor didn't move. After a beat, he stepped aside. Tanner entered slowly, his steps unsure on hardwood floors that echoed with too many memories. Inside, the chill continued. Marilyn and Philip Hayes. His parents greeted him with nods, not hugs. His mother wore her usual navy blazer and that tight-lipped smile she reserved for real estate clients. His father barely looked up from the newspaper. They sat him down at the kitchen table like he was interviewing for a loan. Connor leaned against the counter, arms still crossed. "So Marilyn started. What's the plan?" Tanner swallowed. "Just a few months. I'll pick up some freelance gigs, apply around. I've got some design work I've been tweaking." Connor cut in. "Design?" His tone held a note of scorn. "Tanner, you're 32. Maybe it's time to think practically." Marilyn nodded. "Hayes Realty is doing well. We could use another set of hands. Connor's taken on a lot." Tanner's chest tightened. "This again. I'm not here to join the family business. I just need a place to stay, that's all." Silence stretched between them. His father cleared his throat but said nothing. Finally, Marilyn stood. "You can stay, but just for 6 months, and we expect rent. Modest, but something." Connor added, "And none of that late-night sewing or weird fabric stuff cluttering the house. Keep it in your room." Tanner nodded stiffly. He unpacked that night in his old room, the posters gone. The bookshelves now storing Connor's childhood trophies. He lay on the creaky bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering how things had come to this. The tension didn't ease in the days that followed. Every glance from Connor felt loaded. Every mealtime turned into a subtle interrogation. "How many jobs have you applied to? Are you still wasting time on sketches?" Then came the breaking point. One night at dinner, Tanner brought up a new idea: digitizing Hayes Realty's listings using immersive design tools. He explained how it could boost their marketing, help them reach younger buyers. Connor laughed. "You think you're going to revolutionize real estate with your little artsy apps?" Marilyn sipped her wine. "We don't need gimmicks. Our clients trust tradition." Tanner stood up, fists clenched. I'm trying to help. I'm trying to contribute without giving up who I am. Connor's voice turned ice cold. Then maybe you shouldn't be here. The room went quiet. Philip stared at his plate. Marilyn looked at Tanner like he'd just spoken a different language. That night, Tanner packed a small overnight bag and left to clear his head. He checked into a cheap motel near downtown Asheville, the kind with buzzing lights and peeling walls, thinking he'd cool off and return the next day. He never got the chance. When he pulled into the driveway the next evening, something felt wrong. The house looked the same, but the air was different. He slid his key into the front door. It didn't turn. Confused, he tried again, then tried the side door, then the garage entrance. Nothing. Panic clawed at his chest. He stepped back and pulled out his phone. No missed calls, just a single text from Connor. You're not part of this household anymore. Don't come back. Tanner's breath caught. He sat on the porch steps stunned. His fingers trembled as he opened his banking app, the joint account he and Connor had used for shared expenses during their startup days. It was nearly empty. $900 had been withdrawn by Connor. In less than 24 hours, Tanner had gone from unemployed and discouraged to homeless and robbed. He stared at the locked door. Not just a house, not just a room. His family had shut him out of his life. The motel ceiling was stained with water spots and old cigarette smoke, but Tanner stared at it like it held answers. The room smelled faintly of mildew, and the air conditioner rattled like it had a cough. He lay motionless on the stiff mattress, his duffel bag beside him untouched. Sleep wouldn't come. Not with the weight of that locked door still pressing down on his chest. He rolled onto his side and pulled the scratchy motel blanket closer, but it didn't warm him. Nothing did. His thoughts spun uselessly, circling the same wound, Connor's message. The locked doors, the stolen money. A house that was no longer his and maybe never really had been. But it wasn't Connor's face that filled his mind. Not his mother's clipped voice or his father's synths. No, it was hers, Clara Hayes, his grandmother, his anchor, his sanctuary. She had been the only one who saw him not as a disappointment, not as a burden, but as Tanner, as someone with ideas, with beauty in his hands, with a heart that beat to a rhythm others didn't hear. From the time he was 6, he had followed her like a shadow. Clara was the kind of woman who wore perfume even when no one was visiting, who hummed old jazz standards while she hemmed slacks, and who believed every person had a story to stitch. Her sewing room was sunlight and thimbles and spools of thread in every shade imaginable. He remembered sitting at her feet on a summer afternoon, sorting buttons into jam jars while she repaired a dress for the church pianist. There's a story in every seam, she'd say. If you listen close enough, fabric will speak to you. Tanner had listened. He learned how to hand-stitch before he could ride a bike. She taught him the feel of quality cotton, the whisper of silk, the discipline of precision. Measure twice, cut once, she'd remind him, pressing his small fingers against the cool blade of tailor's shears. But never be afraid to cut. That's how you make something new. He remembered how she'd lean in, close glasses perched on the tip of her nose as he showed her a new design. While everyone else told him to be more realistic, she told him to dream bigger. She called his talent a gift, not a phase. At school, he was the weird kid who liked thread and sketchbooks instead of basketballs and dirt bikes. Connor made sure to remind him of it. So did the other kids. But when he came home, when he slipped into Clara's room and she greeted him with a smile and a new bolt of fabric to explore, it was like the world righted itself. Even her scolding came wrapped in love. You'll make mistakes, she'd say, picking out a crooked seam. But every error teaches you where you need to be steadier next time. Just like life. He remembered the last dress they made together. It was for a friend of hers who had lost her husband. A quiet charcoal gray gown, soft and simple. Clara had let him choose the lining. He picked midnight blue. A little hope where no one else can see, he told her. She smiled so wide her eyes filled with tears. But then came the diagnosis, cancer, fast, cruel, and merciless. Clara began to fade piece by piece. Her stitches slowed. Her hands trembled, but she never stopped creating. Even from the hospice bed, she sketched patterns and corrected his folds with a frail but certain touch. He visited every day he could, even when his parents told him it was too much or when Connor insisted he focus on his business internship. Clara mattered more. She was still teaching even as her time ran out. On her final day, she pulled him close, her fingers like paper, and whispered, "Promise me you won't let them clip your wings, not ever." He promised. He wept, and then she was gone. Tanner stared at the stained ceiling and let the tears come again. He hadn't cried in months, maybe years, but now they came like a flood. He had lost her years ago, but this was the first time he felt truly orphaned. With a shaky breath, he rolled over and grabbed his phone, swiping away useless notifications. Add spam a rejected job application until his eyes froze. Subject urgent. Hayes Family Trust from Walsh & Foster Law Firm. His heart jolted. He opened it. The email was brief but jarring. "Dear Mr. Tanner Hayes, we are reaching out regarding a matter of urgency connected to the estate of the late Clara Hayes. As named representatives of the Hayes Family Trust, we request you contact our office immediately regarding your rights and responsibilities as a beneficiary." A trust, he blinked at the screen, rereading the words until they blurred. Clara had never mentioned a trust, never spoke of inheritance or legal matters. She had always been practical but modest. What could this mean? Then he remembered a conversation just weeks before she passed. They were sitting by her window sipping weak tea and watching the wind move the trees. "I can't protect you forever," she'd said softly, "but I can leave you a thread to follow. You'll know it when you find it." Maybe this was it, the thread. Suddenly Tanner was upright, the fog of grief and humiliation pierced by something sharper purpose. He turned on the lamp and pulled his notebook from the side pocket of his duffel. Not for sketches this time, for strategy. He began writing. Call Walsh and Foster first thing in the morning. Ask about the trust, the will, the conditions. Do not tell Connor anything. The list grew. So did the flame inside him. Not anger, though that flickered too, but something deeper. Resolve. Clara had believed in him enough to leave behind something tangible. Maybe she knew this day would come. Maybe she had prepared for it all along. He closed the notebook and placed it beside the pillow. For the first time since being locked out, he felt something unfamiliar. Hope, and beneath it, something even stronger. He wasn't done yet. Clara had passed him the needle. Now it was his turn to stitch something new from the torn pieces. Tomorrow he would call, and tomorrow the fight would begin. But tonight he slept beneath a ceiling stained by strangers, finally feeling less alone. The thread had found him. The morning air in Asheville was cool, crisp with the scent of mountain dew and faintly sweet pine. Tanner stood outside the tall, sleek building of Walsh and Foster. His palms clammy, his breath visible in the early light. His reflection in the glass doors looked like someone else, rumpled, sleep-deprived, but sharpened with purpose. He stepped inside. The reception area was quiet, minimalist. A receptionist with a calm demeanor and a sharper suit than Tanner had ever owned greeted him with a nod. "Mr. Hayes, they're expecting you." He followed her down a polished corridor to a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. The skyline of Asheville stretched wide and golden in the morning sun, but Tanner barely noticed. His mind raced with every possible scenario. Was this about rent, some lawsuit from Connor? Had they come to officially sever him from the family? The door opened and in walked Edward Walsh, a tall, silver-haired man with a presence that stilled the room. He extended a hand. "Mr. Hayes, thank you for coming. I know the past week has been difficult." "That's an understatement," Tanner muttered, gripping the handshake harder than necessary. Edward gestured to a seat. "I represent the Hayes Family Trust established by your grandmother, Clara Hayes." Tanner froze. She never mentioned a trust. She was very deliberate in her planning. Before her passing, she left detailed instructions for the creation and maintenance of the trust. "You, Mr. Hayes, are a primary beneficiary." Tanner blinked. "Beneficiary of what?" Edward opened a thick folder and slid a document across the table. Legal jargon flooded the page, but one phrase leapt out. "Property of the Clara Hayes Trust, 317 Willow Avenue, Asheville, NC." "That's our family home," Tanner said slowly. Edward nodded. "Legally, it is not owned by your parents or your brother. It belongs to the trust. And per the trust's charter, the house is to remain accessible and available to all direct descendants of Clara Hayes, yourself included, as a place of permanent or temporary residence, free from obstruction." Tanner's mouth went dry. "So, changing the locks is a direct violation of the trust." The words hit him like a drumbeat. Clara had known. She had predicted this. All of it. "There's more," Edward said, drawing out another document. He slid over a financial ledger. "This," he said, "is the Creative Endeavor Fund. Your grandmother designated over $120,000 specifically to support your pursuit of a career in fashion design." Tanner's heart stopped. She did that." Edward's expression grew grave. "Unfortunately, the fund has been accessed over the past 4 years. Withdrawals made by trustees under the justification of home maintenance and upgrades." Tanner leaned forward, eyes scanning the sheet. "Kitchen remodel, backyard deck, new master bath, luxury appliances. They used it to renovate the house." Edward nodded. "And failed to disclose its intended purpose to you. This constitutes a serious breach of fiduciary responsibility." Tanner sank back in his chair, fury and betrayal rising like bile. He thought of every moment he'd struggled to buy thread-skipped meals to save for fabric. Meanwhile, Connor and his parents had siphoned off his future for granite countertops and garden lighting. Edward continued. "The trust includes an alert system. Any changes to the house's physical security without your knowledge trigger a flag. That's why we contacted you. So you knew they locked me out, yes. And that's why we're intervening." Tanner rubbed his face, overwhelmed. "What happens now?" "We'll begin a formal audit and notify the trustees of their breach. Depending on your choice, we can seek restitution, removal of trusteeship, or even legal penalties. I don't want to live with them again," Tanner said quietly. "You don't have to. The trust gives you power to determine your housing arrangement, but you have the right to access the home, and we will ensure you're not excluded again." Edward reached into the folder once more and handed over a small envelope. "This is a letter from your grandmother dated 6 months before her passing." Tanner opened it slowly. The paper trembled in his fingers. "My dearest Tanner, if you're reading this, something has gone wrong. I always feared they wouldn't understand you the way I did. This trust is my way of keeping a promise to protect you when I no longer can. You are my heart, my legacy, and I believe in you with all I have. Use this fund to create, to be free. And never forget, your vision is not a weakness, it is your gift. Sow your life with courage, love always. Grandma Clara." The tears came silently this time, not from pain, but from something else. Validation. She had seen him, believed in him, had carved out a future for him with every stitch. Edward waited patiently. You don't need to decide anything now. But know this, your grandmother set this up for you to have a foundation. A chance, we're here to help you take it. Tanner stood still, holding the letter. He wasn't just Tanner the outcast, the failure, the dreamer without a roof. He was Tanner Hayes, heir to a vision, to protection, and to power they never expected him to claim. And he was just getting started. Back in his motel room, the letter from Clara rested on the nightstand, like a sacred artifact. Tanner sat cross-legged on the creaky bed, rereading her words over and over. Each sentence stitched together something in him that had long been frayed. But with that healing came a deeper ache, the kind that came from remembering just how much had been taken. He stared at the stained ceiling, memories unspooling like spools of thread unraveling. Connor always towering over him, smirking with that insufferable confidence. Designing clothes, you mean, like playing dress-up, grow-up Tanner? That one had stuck sharp and deliberate. His mother, ever composed, ever critical. Art is a hobby, sweetheart. People don't pay bills with creativity. And his father, silent, compliant, complicit. His indifference had been the worst betrayal of all. Tanner remembered one night in particular. He'd won a local design contest, a small event at the community center. He'd come home beaming, clutching a ribbon and a $50 gift card. Connor laughed when he saw it. Guess you can buy more glitter glue. His mother had offered a weak smile, her eyes already drifting back to her laptop screen. His father didn't even look up from his newspaper. But Clara had called him that night. Her voice warm, her praise genuine. I always knew you had it in you, she'd said. Don't let their noise drown out your song. Tanner clutched her letter now, that same warmth pulsing from the ink. There was more to this. The trust, the money, the house, those were just the surface. The real legacy Clara had left was belief. And she had done more than just believe. She had fought for him, protected him, prepared for the storm she saw brewing long before Tanner did. He remembered another moment, one he'd buried deep. A Thanksgiving dinner 2 years before Clara passed. Connor had cornered Clara in the study. Tanner hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but when he heard his name, he froze outside the door. I'm just saying, Connor had whispered, you should revisit the will. Tanner doesn't even live here anymore. You're handing resources to someone who's never going to make anything of himself. I'll thank you not to tell me how to manage my affairs, Clara had replied, voice icy. I know who Tanner is, and I trust him with my legacy. That memory stung now, Clara's quiet defiance, Connor's calculated manipulation. It confirmed everything. Tanner stood abruptly and paced the room. His reflection in the motel mirror startled him. Tired eyes, clenched jaw, a fury that had nowhere to go. He needed answers, or maybe just someone who could tell him he wasn't imagining all this. He picked up his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found one he hadn't used in years. Justin Porter. His cousin, a few years older, had always seemed a little distant. They weren't close, but Justin was also the kind of person who noticed things. The call rang twice. Tanner. Hey man, got a minute? Of course, I heard what happened. You okay? No, but I'm figuring it out. Listen, did Grandma Clara ever talk to you about the trust about me? There was a pause. Then Justin exhaled slowly. Not in detail, but... Yeah. She said she had a plan for you, that she had to be careful. Said Connor was pressuring her to rewrite things, to cut you out. Tanner's breath caught. She said that, yeah, I think she knew what was coming. She asked me to be a local contact for the trust, said if anything ever happened, I'd be one of the people they'd call. Tanner sank down into the chair, heart pounding. Why didn't you ever say anything? She made me promise not to interfere unless you were in danger or being kept from what was rightfully yours. She said it had to come from you, that you had to be ready. Tanner stared at the motel carpet, trying to process it all. Justin, he said after a long pause, do you think she knew about the way they treated me? I think she knew more than she let on. Justin replied gently. She wasn't naive. She watched them, the way they spoke to you, the way they praised Connor for every little thing. She once told me you had a spirit they couldn't tame, so they tried to break it. Her words, not mine. Tanner felt something inside him crack open. Grief, anger, relief, it all swirled. She loved you, Tanner, fiercely, and she made sure you had something they couldn't touch. They talked a while longer, and by the time they hung up, Tanner felt steadier. He wasn't imagining things. Clara had seen and she had acted, and now the pieces were finally coming together. He picked up her letter one more time and read the last line again. Sow your life with courage. He would. But he would also defend her legacy with everything he had. Because betrayal ran deep, but love, the kind Clara gave him, ran deeper. And it was time to cut a new pattern from the scraps they'd left him. The boardroom at Walsh and Foster was bathed in harsh winter light. Everything about it was designed to intimidate: glass, chrome, sharp lines, and slits. Edward Walsh sat at the head of the long table with a stack of carefully arranged files in front of him. Tanner sat to his right, calm but alert. Clara's letter folded neatly in the inner pocket of his coat. Across from him sat his parents and Connor. Their expressions ranged from irritated to amused, as if this were an inconvenience rather than a reckoning. Connor was the first to speak. I assume this is about the misunderstanding with the locks. We've already explained. Edward raised a hand. We are here because the terms of Clara Hayes's trust have been breached. This meeting is not a negotiation, it is a clarification. Connor scoffed. It's a house, our house. Tanner hasn't lived there in years. We thought. Edward opened the first file and began reading aloud. Clause 4. Section 3. The residence at 317 Willow Avenue shall remain available at all times as a place of primary or secondary residence for Tanner Hayes. And no modifications to security access or shared amenities shall occur without his written consent. Tanner watched his mother's lips tighten, his father still refusing to meet his eyes. We didn't know it was that strict, she muttered. You were given a copy of the trust 5 years ago, Edward replied. And further, we have documentation of key withdrawals from the Creative Endeavor Fund, originally valued at $120,000. Shall I go through the list? He did, item by item. Tanner sat motionless as the charges rolled out. $4,000 for a sub-zero fridge. $7 earned, $500 for deck resurfacing. $3 and $200 for bathroom fixtures. Connor leaned forward. That money went into the house for upgrades that benefit the whole family. We weren't stealing. We were investing in its future. You were explicitly informed of the fund's purpose. Edward countered. Your signatures are on the annual disclosures. You repurposed assets meant for Tanner's career. That's a misuse of fiduciary responsibility. There was a beat of silence. Tanner took a breath. You didn't just take money, you took opportunity. When I couldn't afford tuition, when I skipped meals, when I thought maybe I really wasn't meant to design. It wasn't because I failed. It's because you already decided I wouldn't succeed. His voice didn't shake, though the weight behind it filled the room. I used to think something was wrong with me, that maybe I was too sensitive, too soft, but I was just growing in soil that kept poisoning me. His father finally looked up but said nothing. And you, Tanner continued, turning to Connor, mocked me, undermined me, and now you act like locking me out was a minor error. It wasn't. It was calculated. You knew I was down and you kicked me lower. Tanner, his mother began, but he raised a hand. I'm not here for apologies. I'm here to protect what's mine and what Clara wanted from me. But I'm not seeking revenge. He turned to Edward. I'd like to propose a resolution. Edward nodded. Proceed. I want full residential rights restored immediately. I'll stay in the guest house. I want exclusive control of the creative fund with oversight from the firm. And I want Connor and my parents removed as trustees. You can't, Connor started, but Edward held up a form. You've already violated 3 major clauses. Legally, we are within bounds to remove all current trustees and appoint replacements. Tanner looked across the table. You can keep your new fridge, keep your deck. I'm not taking back what you spent, but I'm reclaiming what Clara left for me. His mother's expression cracked first. Sadness, maybe shame. His father nodded faintly, like he'd finally registered Tanner as something more than background noise. Connor said nothing. Tanner stood. This isn't about furniture or inheritance. This is about a woman who believed in something when no one else did. I won't let her down. And with that, the meeting was over. Tanner walked out into the bright morning free of something he couldn't quite name. Not revenge, not victory, just clarity and peace. The terms came 2 days later, bound in a thick manila envelope, its weight far heavier than the paper inside. It was the formal end to a lifetime of blurred loyalties, silent injuries, and unanswered questions. But Tanner already knew what they would say. He had spoken his truth in that boardroom. This was simply the echo in ink. Edward Walsh had called shortly after the meeting, his voice steady. They've asked for time to consider. You'll hear back in 48 hours. Tanner hadn't waited by the phone. He didn't need to. Instead, he walked through Asheville's older neighborhoods with a local real estate agent eyes skimming over weathered porches and ivy-covered gates. He wasn't looking for grandeur. He was looking for home. Somewhere sunlight touched the windows just right. Somewhere a sewing machine could hum undisturbed. The place he found was simple, a craftsman-style cottage with chipped paint, squeaky floors, and a back room flooded with natural light, perfect for a studio. It would be his, purchased entirely from the misused portion of the Creative Endeavor Fund, now reclaimed and redirected. Not a reward, not a handout, just a restoration of what had been taken. The remaining terms were non-negotiable. The Hayes family could keep the Willow Avenue house, but under strict oversight. A neutral third-party trustee chosen by Walsh and Foster would review all spending, maintenance, and property decisions. No more unchecked power. All contact would cease. Tanner had the right to total separation unless he chose otherwise. No forced holidays, no birthday texts laced with guilt. No surprise visits framed as reconciliations. The boundary was legal, personal, and permanent. The trust would remain open, but only to fund Tanner's career. Any future creative endeavors, education, or business ventures would be vetted and supported under the guidance of Walsh and Foster. Connor's reaction, as Edward later described, had been volcanic. He shouted, accused you of tearing the family apart, claimed you were brainwashed by Clara. He refused to sign until your father reminded him that without settlement we'd go to court. And he'd likely lose. Marilyn wept, not with regret, but from loss. Her face, Edward noted, remained perfectly composed even as the tissues piled up. Philip never spoke, not once. He signed the documents and left before the others. No one asked to speak to Tanner. No one wrote. No apology came. And still he felt lighter than he had in years. On the morning of his move, Tanner walked through his new home with coffee in hand. The air smelled like fresh plaster and old wood. He laid out rolls of muslin across the kitchen table, letting his fingers trace future silhouettes. He pinned Clara's letter above his workspace, right where sunlight hit at noon. A call came in just after lunch. Edward again. They've signed everything, it's done. Tanner said nothing at first. Any final words you'd like me to pass on? Edward asked. Tanner smiled faintly. No. Let silence say the rest, because he no longer needed a final conversation to close the book. He had learned that closure doesn't come from their remorse. It comes from reclaiming your space and choosing peace over permission. That night, Tanner opened a fresh sketchbook. He sketched his first design in months: clean lines, bold shoulders, soft pleats. A blend of strength and gentleness. He imagined Clara watching, her hands folded, eyes proud, and in the quiet surrounded by threadlight and freedom. Tanner stitched the beginning of his new life. It was not a victory marked by applause, but by dignity, and that was enough. The boxes arrived 1 week after Tanner settled into his new home. They were stacked neatly on the porch, no return address, just his name, handwritten in the familiar cursive of his mother. He debated leaving them untouched, but curiosity, like memory, was hard to silence. Inside he found remnants of another life: old family photos, school certificates, and a weathered sewing kit wrapped in floral cloth. At the bottom of one box lay Clara's notebook, the one she always scribbled in during her quiet hours. Its pages were filled with sketches, quotes, and fragments of encouragement. One note read, "For Tanner, your hands hold stories worth stitching." He wept, not out of weakness but release. It was the first time in years he let the tears fall without shame. That afternoon, he arranged the sewing kit beside his own tools, gently placing Clara's notebook next to his design journal. It felt like continuity, not a return to the past, but a thread through it. With renewed purpose, Tanner returned to the drawing board. He used the remaining trust funds to purchase quality fabrics, restore his website, and begin his first full collection. It wasn't about proving anything anymore. It was about expression, healing, and finally being seen. Each garment he sketched reflected a part of his journey: soft textures for vulnerability, bold colors for defiance, clean lines for clarity. The process was meticulous but therapeutic. Stitch by stitch, the past lost its power to wound. His days took on rhythm. Mornings began with black coffee and long walks through Asheville's winding streets. He watched as seasons shifted in quiet symmetry: maple leaves turning gold, dogwoods bursting into bloom. He sketched in parks, in cafes, on street corners. His notebook became a second skin. The cottage grew into more than shelter. It became a sanctuary. Each corner bore signs of his craft: fabric swatches pinned to walls, chalk marks on mirrors, pinned mannequins in the living room. Tanner began therapy with Dr. Sharon Miller, a trauma-informed psychologist recommended by Walsh and Foster. At first, their sessions felt stiff, clinical, but Sharon had a quiet way of listening that made silence feel safe. Over weeks, he unpacked the hidden weight of years. The biting comments, the passive indifference, the sense of being invisible within his own family. Sharon never rushed him. Instead, she helped him connect the dots to see that his dreams weren't delusions but defiant acts of survival. He remembered through her guidance small moments he had forgotten: the look in Clara's eyes when he showed her his first stitched hem, the day she let him pick out his own fabric for a birthday present. They were quiet testaments to belief. "You learn to become smaller to stay loved," she told him once. "Now you're learning how to take up space." It struck him like truth always does. Quiet, sharp, liberating. Tanner began volunteering at a local community center, teaching basic sewing skills to at-risk youth. At first, only 2 students showed up, then 4, then a dozen. He didn't speak much about his past, but they sensed it. They trusted him. One boy, Noah, reminded him of himself: wide-eyed, anxious, afraid to touch fabric the wrong way. Tanner showed him how to thread a needle, how to keep the tension even. "It's not about being perfect," he said. "It's about showing up." In helping others, he helped himself. The work gave structure to healing. Evenings were quieter. Sometimes he sat on his porch with a blanket sipping tea, listening to the city settle into dusk. He started writing 2 short reflections, bits of letters, never sent fragments of memories stitched together with honesty. His dreams changed. No longer filled with confrontations or guilt, but gentle images, Clara's garden fabric unfurling in sunlight, laughter shared over soup. He started seeing his past differently, not as a weight, but as soil. Hard, rocky, uneven, but fertile in its own way. It had grown him. His new home slowly took shape around him. The studio brimmed with fabric samples and colored pencils. The living room held only a sofa and a second-hand record player. But there was music. There was light. There was peace. Tanner still had doubts, still woke sometimes with the ache of old wounds. But he no longer lived inside them. They were part of his story, not the whole of it. And in the quiet sanctuary he'd carved for himself, the sewing machine hummed once more, a lullaby of becoming. Naming the brand had come slowly with hesitation. Tanner wanted something meaningful, something that stitched together who he was, who he had been, and who he was becoming. One evening, as he reread Clara's note in her weathered notebook, he paused at the line, "Your hands hold stories worth stitching." The words echoed, and then he saw it clearly, like a finished hemline, Clara's thread. The name wasn't just homage, it was mission. Every stitch, every pattern, every fold would carry her spirit forward. He filed the trademark paperwork the next morning. Soon after, Tanner applied and was accepted into a local fashion startup accelerator. The program brought together young designers, industry veterans, and brand strategists under one roof. His mentor, Elise Carmichael, was a former Vogue editor who had left New York to focus on socially driven design. "I'm not here to help you become famous," Elise told him in their first meeting. "I'm here to help you become clear." Together they refined his collection, built a brand story, and reimagined his business as one rooted in narrative and purpose. Elise encouraged him to share more than designs. She urged him to share his journey. Reluctantly, Tanner opened up. He told the story of Clara, of the house he'd been locked out of the letter that changed everything. The story became the heart of Clara's thread. On his website, a page titled "The Stitch That Saved Me" featured scanned pages from Clara's notebook, excerpts from his personal journal, and a video of him sewing in the sunlit room of his Asheville home. The response was overwhelming. Emails poured in, stories of estrangement, resilience, and healing from strangers who now saw their own scars in his seams. Tanner wasn't just building a brand, he was building a conversation. Then came the invitation: Fashion Expo Southeast, one of the most anticipated showcases for emerging designers. His collection had been selected for a full runway presentation. At first, Tanner hesitated. The spotlight was not his natural habitat, but Sharon, his therapist, reminded him, "You're not stepping onto a stage to perform. You're stepping up to be seen." He said yes. And in the days that followed, as fabrics were dyed, looks finalized, and models cast, Tanner felt a shift inside. He wasn't walking away from the past. He was walking forward with it, thread by thread, story by story. And somewhere he imagined Clara smiling, because all of it was stitched in her name. The runway lights dimmed and the first model stepped forward, draped in a piece Tanner had called "Rooted." The audience hushed. Every fabric fold, every deliberate stitch seemed to whisper a story only some would fully understand. But all would feel. Clara's thread made its official debut. What followed was a crescendo of claps, then cheers. Reporters circled backstage. Buyers requested private appointments. But what moved Tanner most were the people who came not just to see fashion, but to connect with the story. They asked about Clara, about his journey, about healing. One woman clutched his hand after the show. "I haven't spoken to my daughter in years," she said. "Tonight I think I'll try." It wasn't just fashion. It was reflection. It was a mirror and in some cases a window. Over the next few weeks, Clara's thread began to garner attention in both niche and mainstream media. Fashion blogs praised the craftsmanship. Mental health advocates applauded the brand's emotional transparency. Emails, letters, DMs flooded in, and Tanner answered as many as he could. He found himself speaking on podcasts, writing editorials, even being invited to speak at a creative arts therapy seminar. Though public speaking never came easy, Tanner spoke with quiet conviction. His vulnerability became his strength. But amid the noise, he held close to his new truth. He no longer needed to be accepted by those who had rejected him. For the first time, Tanner saw family not as blood, but as presence, consistency, choice. Justin became more than a cousin. He became a friend Tanner trusted with silence and laughter. They spent long afternoons talking, remembering Clara not with sorrow but with gratitude. Justin even started helping with fabric sourcing, joking that he'd trade stock reports for color swatches any day. On weekends, they hosted small dinners with other creatives, shared meals filled with laughter, candles flickering over mismatched plates. Tanner looked around those tables and realized he had built something sacred. His new friends from the accelerator became anchors, Elise with her fierce honesty, fellow designers who understood the dance of doubt and daring. They celebrated small wins and offered warmth during tough ones. Their group chats were full of sketches, memes, and late-night encouragements. One night, while editing his blog post for Clara's thread, Tanner's phone buzzed. Unknown caller, then voicemail. He listened. Marilyn. Her voice was soft, hesitant. "I saw your show," she said. "You looked grown. I didn't know how to reach you. I just wanted to say—" She didn't finish. The message cut out. Tanner stared at the screen. Then with a quiet breath, he set the phone down and turned back to his writing. There was nothing cruel in the choice, only clarity. Because some closures don't need door slams, they just need you to start knocking. And in that moment, he realized forgiveness wasn't always an act of welcoming. Sometimes it was simply the decision to move on fully, freely, and without waiting for anyone to catch up. He smiled, then hit publish. Later that evening, he sewed until midnight, finishing a piece he called Unspoken. It was delicate, it was bold, and it was his. Tanner stood on the balcony of his Asheville apartment, the morning sun casting golden light through sheer curtains that swayed gently in the summer breeze. Below, the city hummed with quiet purpose, coffee shops opening, dogs being walked, children's laughter skipping across sidewalks. He closed his eyes for a moment, breathing in the scent of fresh linen and blooming magnolias. It had been almost a year since the day he'd arrived at that motel stripped of belonging. And now, standing barefoot with a mug of chamomile tea, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not just calm, but whole. His studio was full of sketches pinned to walls, half-draped mannequins, and fabric rolls stacked in cozy chaos. In the corner, a small altar of sorts. Clara's notebook, her photo framed in a silver stand, and the vintage sewing kit she had given him when he was 13. He pulled out her last letter once more. He had read it so many times, the creases now felt like familiar pathways under his fingers. Her handwriting, soft and sloping, carried a weight no voice ever had. "My dear Tanner, you do not need to be accepted to belong. You do not need to be applauded to matter. All I ever wanted was for you to be seen, truly seen. And now I see you. Fully. You are not broken, you are becoming. With all the love I have, Clara." He pressed the letter to his chest, then folded it back into the envelope. That afternoon, he carefully wrapped a gift, an elegant vest he had designed in soft charcoal wool lined with navy silk. The seams were perfect, the inner pocket embroidered with a single phrase, "Thank you." He placed the vest in a small box, wrapped it in linen, and tucked inside a handwritten note. "For Grandma Clara, you saw me first." He didn't know where to send it. Maybe he'd keep it by her photo, maybe he'd bury it in the garden. Maybe it didn't need to go anywhere, because some messages weren't for delivery. They were for release. Tanner stood at the doorway of his studio and looked around. It was messy, it was imperfect, and it was his. He picked up a spool of thread and smiled. That was all he needed to be. Just Tanner, just himself.